Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the absolute heart of game design, really, truly understanding the player. This is the thing that separates a game that's just okay from a game that you can't stop thinking about.
So, let's start with the biggest question of them all, right? The one that every single designer has to grapple with. What is it? What's that magic ingredient that actually makes a game fun?
Well, it turns out the secret isn't some kind of magic formula. It's not just about the slickest mechanics or the most mind-blowing graphics. The real key is a player-centric approach. It's all about making a real, emotional connection with the person who's actually playing.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to look at players through three different lenses: the psychology of why we play, the demographics of who plays, and the spectrum of how dedicated they are. And then we'll pull it all together with the big secret: inclusiveness.
First up, let's get into the psychology of it. We're going to explore something called the 5 domains of play, which is a really cool framework from Ubisoft's Jason Vandenberg that helps us get what really motivates us to pick up a controller in the first place.
Now, this whole idea is built on some seriously solid ground. It's based on the 5-factor model of personality. You might have heard of it as the Big Five. It uses that handy acronym OCEAN. That's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It's a super stable way to look at personality that holds up across all kinds of different people and cultures.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. Vandenberg's theory draws a direct line from these core personality traits to the kinds of experiences we look for in games. The idea is that we're drawn to games that satisfy these deep-seated motivations, especially if we're not getting them satisfied in our real lives. Games kind of become a safe outlet for these needs.
So what does that actually look like? Well, a player who scores high in openness might absolutely crave the novelty of some weird, wonderful indie game. On the other hand, someone else might find comfort in the familiar routine of Words with Friends. And get this, someone high in neuroticism, they might actually seek out the threat in a survival horror game. Why? Because it lets them experience those intense feelings in a totally safe and controlled environment. It's like a map to our desires.
All right, so if that's the internal map of a player's mind, what happens when we start looking at external factors? We're going to shift gears from psychology to demographics, things like gender and age, and see how that changes the design conversation. This quote from designer Cherie Grenier really just cuts right to the chase. For way too long, the default player in a designer's head was just a guy. But the data doesn't lie. In the US, there are actually more adult women playing video games than teenage boys. The point isn't to lean into stereotypes. It's to realize that what men and women want from games overlaps way, way more than you might think. And this gets to the real goal here. If you want to attract a bigger audience, you don't have to make some kind of stereotypical game for women. No, the trick is to just avoid the stuff that actively pushes away players who would otherwise probably love what you've made. It's about taking down barriers, not, slapping a pink bow on everything.
And what about younger players? It's a massive mistake to just think of kids as smaller, less skilled adults. That's not how it works. Their brains are still developing. The way they handle logic, their motor skills, it's all fundamentally different. And that means you have to design for them in a completely different way.
This is just brilliant. Carolyn Handler-Miller, a developer in children's media, calls these the 7 kisses of death. They're all these common myths that just lead to awful games for kids. This idea that kids only want things that are sweet or safe or wholesome, it just leads to boring, condescending junk. The reality is, kids can handle depth and challenge and even flawed characters, just like the rest of us.
Okay, for our third and final lens, we're changing our focus one more time. We're going to move away from who the player is and start looking at how they play. This means we have to get past those really simple labels like hardcore and casual.
Yeah, player commitment is definitely not an on-off switch. It's a whole spectrum of dedication. And you can measure it in all sorts of ways, from how much money they're willing to spend, to how much frustration they'll put up with, or even just how long they'll play in one sitting.
Figuring out where your target player lands on this spectrum is just everything. I mean, are you making a game for someone who's going to play for 15 minutes on the bus? Or are you designing for the person who's going to pour 100 hours into mastering every single system and then start making their own mods? The answer to that question changes everything, from your difficulty curve to your entire business model.
So, we've looked at players psychologically, demographically, and behaviorally. Now, it's time to bring it all home and talk about the single most important design principle that ties all of this together.
One of the absolute biggest traps a designer can fall into is what's called binary thinking. This is when you assume that if one group, let's say adult men,
likes a certain thing, then another group, like adult women, must automatically dislike it. It's just flawed logic, and it can make you miss out on a massive chunk of your potential audience.
And here's why that's such a huge deal. If you look at it statistically, sure, the average interest might be a little different between groups, but that area of overlap in the middle, it's almost always massive. Ignoring that common ground is basically like seeing a giant pile of money on the table and deciding to just walk away.
The way you avoid that trap is by identifying and removing what's known as exclusionary material. Now, this can be really obvious stuff, like racist or sexist content, but it can also be a lot more subtle, things like ugly artwork, or a story that feels totally forced into a puzzle game, or even just controls that are frustrating for no good reason.
And really, that's the ultimate takeaway. The goal isn't to be universal by just cramming a feature in for everybody. That just makes a messy, confusing game. The goal is to be inclusive. And you do that by thoughtfully, carefully removing the barriers, the frustrations, and the stuff that just unnecessarily pushes good players away.
So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. What games have you played that made you feel truly welcome, without feeling like they were dumbed down? Because at the end of the day, understanding your player isn't just some academic exercise. It is the fundamental secret behind every single game that truly connects with an audience.